Hey friends, tonight we're raising a glass to one of humanity's oldest companions, a drink that's older than the wheel, older than written language, older than most of the civilizations we still talk about today. Beer. It's been brewed for more than 7,000 years by farmers, monks, merchants, ship captains, and curious home brewers. It's been poured into clay jars, silver goblets, wooden tankards, pint glasses, and yes, the occasional red solo cup at barbecues. Beer has traveled from the banks of the Euphrates to the cellars of medieval abbeys, from the beer halls of Munich to the tap rooms of Portland. It's quenched the thirst of pyramid builders, fueled the songs of sailors, toasted weddings, accompanied quiet evenings, and inspired more than one person to decide they could probably play guitar in public. Tonight, we're going to trace that journey slowly, from the first frothy bowls in ancient Mesopotamia to the foamy steins of Bavaria to the hoppy haze of the modern craft beer revolution. The pace will be gentle, like a slow pour, letting the foam settle just right. The details will be rich. The taste of history will be, well, you'll see. So settle back. The lights are dim, the glasses are chilled, and the long story of beer is ready to flow. Go ahead and like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and your favorite beer there, or just your favorite beer, period. If you wanted a beer 7,000 years ago, you wouldn't have found it in a pub. You wouldn't have even called it beer. You'd have found something cloudy, warm, served in a clay jar, and you probably would have drunk it through a straw to avoid the bits of grain still floating in it. Welcome to ancient Mesopotamia. Around 5000 BCE, the Sumerians were already fermenting barley into a drink that historians often call liquid bread. It was thick, nutritious, and safer than drinking most water. They didn't write recipes the way we do, but we know they took bread, baked from barley, crumbled it into water, and let it ferment with wild yeast. The result? Something earthy, yeasty, and just alcoholic enough to make life along the rivers feel a little more manageable. And they didn't just drink it, they celebrated it. One of the oldest pieces of writing we have is the hymn to Ninkasi, a poetic recipe to the Sumerian goddess of beer. Ninkasi, you are the one who waters the malt set on the ground. You are the one who soaks the malt in a jar. You are the one who holds with both hands the great sweet wort. You are the one who pours out the filtered beer of the collector vat. It is the onrush of Tigris and Euphrates. It's part prayer, part brewing manual, and entirely proof that beer was central to life and culture. By around 3000 BCE, the Egyptians had adopted beer as a staple. It wasn't just for celebrations, it was for everyone, from pharaohs to farmers to the workers hauling limestone blocks to build the pyramids. The air around a brewery in ancient Egypt must have been rich with the scent of grain mash warming over fires, the faint sweetness of dates sometimes added for flavor. Clay vessels lined the walls, each one sealed with mud to keep the precious brew safe. Beer was payment. Beer was nutrition. Beer was ritual. It was left in tombs for the afterlife. And while their recipes evolved from the Sumerian style, it was still thick, cloudy, and far from the golden lagers of today. but it was beloved, essential, and a daily presence. Mesopotamia and Egypt weren't just brewing for themselves, they were creating a template: beer as daily sustenance, beer as an economic tool, beer as a cultural constant. From here, beer's story would branch out in countless directions, but in the clay jars along the Tigris, in the sealed amphorae of the Nile, the world's first pints had been poured. And the taste of history, well, it was just getting started. Beer wasn't just a Mesopotamian and Egyptian idea. All over the world, people were figuring out the same basic truth. If you leave grain and water together long enough, the magic of fermentation will find you. And so beer, in its many early forms, started bubbling up in cultures far from the Tigris and Nile. Over in what is now northern China, archaeologists have found evidence of beer like drinks as far back as 7000 BCE, older than the Sumerians' liquid bread. But the ingredients? Slightly different. Instead of barley and wheat, ancient Chinese brewers used millet, rice, and sometimes tubers. The flavor would have been gentler, a little sweeter, maybe faintly earthy. Picture it: a ceramic vessel half buried in the earth for coolness, sealed with a tight fitting lid. Inside, the liquid is cloudy with a pale golden hue. A faint aroma of grain rises as the lid is lifted, along with a whisper of something fruity from whatever natural yeast happened to be nearby. This wasn't a beer for foamy pints. It was a beer for bowls, sipped in quiet moments, perhaps during a festival, maybe around a small fire in a cool evening breeze. Far to the west, the Celts, Germanic tribes, and other northern Europeans, well, they had their own brewing traditions, and they weren't afraid to add a little personality. Beer here was often brewed with grut, a mix of herbs and spices used before hops became standard. Yarrow, bog myrtle, rosemary, juniper, they all could make their way into the kettle. And the result? A drink with a rich malt backbone, laced with herbal bitterness, maybe even a touch of floral perfume. Imagine sipping a dark, malty brew by firelight, the scent of wood smoke curling in the air, and the taste carrying a whisper of the wild plants that grew just beyond the edge of the village. Now, for these societies, beer was so much more than just a refreshment. It was part of ritual life. It was tied to feasts, seasonal celebrations, and, of course, offerings to the gods. And then there were the Greeks and Romans. Beer existed in their world, but it wasn't the star. For them, wine was the drink of sophistication. Beer, that was the rustic cousin, fine for soldiers, farmers, and barbarian allies, but not for elegant banquets. Roman writers sometimes mentioned beer with a tone somewhere between curiosity and mild disdain. Tacitus, writing about Germanic tribes, couldn't resist describing their beer as a fermented barley drink corrupted into intoxication. Still, beer had its place. Roman soldiers stationed along the northern frontiers learned to drink the local brews, sometimes even adopting their brewing techniques. You can imagine a legionnaire in some rainy outpost on the Rhine, missing Italian wine, but finding comfort in a sturdy local ale that was thick, filling, and, most importantly, available. By this point in history, beer had become what it would remain for thousands of years, a drink that adapted to its environment. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, it was thick and nourishing. In China, it was pale, smooth, and made from local grains. In Northern Europe, it was dark, herbal, and hearty enough to keep you warm. In Greece and Rome, it was a cultural curiosity, valued in the provinces, if not in the capital. If you could line them all up on a table, a clay jar from the Sumerians, a sealed pot from China, a horn cup of Celtic Groot ale, and a Roman amphory from a frontier tavern, well, you'd see the same core idea in a dozen different outfits: cloudy, clear, herbal, sweet, bitter, and earthy. Beer was already proving it could be whatever the moment required. And while the ancient world brewed in its own unique styles, one region was about to turn beer into a disciplined, perfected art form: the monks of medieval Europe, who would bring order, patience, and just the right amount of fermentation magic to every pint. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, beer had already traveled across empires, through ports, and into countless clay jars. But in Europe, something special was happening. Beer was about to become more than just a drink of survival. It was about to become an art, and the artists, monks. In the Middle Ages, monasteries weren't just places of prayer. They were centers of learning, agriculture, and brewing. Monks brewed beer for three main reasons: nourishment. Beer was considered a safe, reliable food source, rich in calories and nutrients. Hospitality. Monasteries often welcomed travelers, pilgrims, and the occasional tired noble, all of whom needed refreshment. And finally, revenue. Extra beer could be sold or traded, helping fund the abbey's upkeep. And because monasteries kept meticulous records and valued discipline, they perfected brewing techniques in a way few others could. Picture this: a cool stone wall brewhouse tucked just off the main courtyard. Long wooden benches dust with grain husks, great copper kettles set over a slow fire, steam curling into the dim light. The air is thick with the sweet, bready scent of malted barley warming in the mash tun. You can hear the slow trickle of liquid being transferred to the kettle, the soft murmur of monks discussing the day's tasks in Latin. Outside, in neat rows along the garden wall, herbs and early hops grow, their scent faintly spicy in the cool air. In the Middle Ages, beer wasn't just a treat, it was a daily drink. The water supply could be unreliable, but beer, even low alcohol beer, was boiled during brewing, making it much safer to drink. So monasteries brewed different strengths for different needs: stronger beers for special occasions, feasts, or honored guests; milder, small beers for everyday drinking, even for children. In some abbeys, the daily ration of beer for each monk was several liters, though, to be fair, much of that was low alcohol. Beer in the early Middle Ages was usually flavored with Groot, a blend of herbs like yarrow, mugwort, rosemary, or bog myrtle. But around the 8th to 12th centuries, hops slowly began to appear. Hops did two crucial things. They added a pleasant bitterness that balanced the sweetness of malt, and they acted as a natural preservative, keeping beer fresher longer. Imagine the first time a monk sipped a hopped beer, the soft aroma of flowers and spice rising from the cup, the gentle bite of bitterness playing against the smooth malt. It must have felt like a small miracle. Over centuries, monasteries built a brewing tradition that became the foundation of many modern beer styles. Belgian Trappist ales, Abbey doubles and triples, strong, rich beers designed to sustain monks through periods of fasting. The monks didn't just brew for themselves, they brewed for pilgrims and travelers and townsfolk. The beer became part of the culture, not just sustenance, but a shared joy. And because monks were literate and meticulous, they really did document everything about their brewing. Recipes, techniques, timing, these were all carefully recorded. And that discipline, that devotion to craft, is why some of the most famous beers in the world today still trace their lineage back to medieval monasteries. Picture the end of a brewing day. The sun setting beyond the cloister arches, the warm smell of spent grain lingering in the brewhouse, the monks gathered at long tables, wooden mugs in hand. The beer is simple, unfiltered, golden with a soft haze. The foam clings just slightly to the rim as they drink. Outside, a breeze carries the faint scent of hops from the garden. Inside, the only sounds are quiet conversation and the faint echo of footsteps in the stone halls. The Middle Ages could be chaotic outside the monastery walls. Plagues, wars, shifting borders. But in here, the brewing continues, patient, steady, year after year. And beer, once again, is both a necessity and a small comfort. In the Renaissance, beer wasn't just a drink, it was a necessity. Across much of Europe in the 15th through the 17th centuries, beer was much more reliable than the local water supply. Wells could be tainted, rivers carried waste from tanneries, dye houses, and livestock pens. Cities had grown faster than sanitation could keep up. But beer had been boiled during brewing. The fermentation created an environment that harmful bacteria couldn't survive in. It was mildly alcoholic, nutritious, and available in vast quantities. If you were thirsty in 1500, by far the safest cup you could drink was beer. And not just the rich, for everyone, from a blacksmith in Antwerp to a dock worker in Hamburg to a child in rural England, beer was a daily staple. By the Renaissance, beer was everywhere. At home, brewed in kitchens for family use, in taverns, poured by the jug or tankard, at work, given as part of wages, and of course in monasteries, refined and sold to support the abbey. In small towns, records show per capita beer consumption 10 times higher than today, much of it small beer with very low alcohol drunk throughout the day. As beer's popularity grew, so did its importance as a trade. In cities like Hamburg, Bruges, and Munich, Brewing became a respected profession. Brewers' guilds were established to maintain quality, to set prices, and protect the interests of their members. Guilds also standardized recipes, creating consistent, reliable beer styles that could be trusted by merchants and travelers. And yes, they also lobbied for rules that would keep competitors, and especially wine sellers, from encroaching too far on their businesses. Step inside a beer hall in 16th century Germany. A long, timbered room lit by the warm glow of candles. Heavy wooden tables stained from years of spilled ale. Benches crowded with merchants, travelers, and locals. The air is rich with the scent of malt, roasted meats, wood smoke, and the faint tang of spilled beer soaking into the floorboards. A serving maid weaves through the crowd with a tray of foaming stoneware mugs, setting them down with a satisfying thunk that cuts through the din of conversation. At one table, a merchant counts coins. At another, a student recites lines of poetry, sloshing his drink for emphasis. In the back, two farmers negotiate the sale of barley over a third round. Beer isn't just refreshment here, it's currency, culture, and community. Beer was so tied to civic life that in many towns, brewing was overseen by the local council. Taxes on beer sales were a major source of revenue. Some cities even built municipal breweries to ensure a steady, controlled supply. In Munich, beer became such a central part of life that the city council issued the Reinheitsgebot in 1516, the famous Bavarian purity law. It allowed beer to be made only from water, barley, and hops. Yeast would be added later when its role was more understood. The law wasn't just about purity, it was about controlling grain prices and ensuring affordable bread and protecting beer as the reliable daily drink. Whether you were a wealthy merchant or a village laborer, beer was the drink that sustained you. In palaces, beer might be served in silver goblets, accompanied by roasted pheasant. In farmhouses, it was poured from earthen jugs into wooden mugs alongside bread and cheese. But the taste, malty, nourishing, faintly bitter, was a familiar thread that connected everyone. Beer had become more than survival. It was comfort. It was social glue. It was daily ritual. And as the Renaissance gave way to the early modern era, beer would travel even further, carried across oceans, stowed in barrels on ships, destined for colonies and far off markets. By the 16th and 17th centuries, beer had already conquered Europe. Now it was about to cross oceans. The age of exploration was in full swing, and ships were sailing further and longer than ever before. With them traveled people, goods, and barrels of beer. Long voyages needed provisions that wouldn't spoil, and beer fit the bill perfectly. It was safer than water, still true in the 1600s. It was relatively stable in barrels, and it provided calories and morale for sailors spending weeks or even months at sea. Picture the deck of a merchant ship leaving Amsterdam in 1625. The salt air stings as sailors heave heavy oak casks aboard, each one filled with beer brewed for the long journey. The smell of malt mingles with the tarred ropes and pine planks. Below deck, the beer is stored alongside salted meat, hardtack, dried peas, all the basic fuel for crossing. But when the seas get rough and the days long, that beer is more than sustenance. It's comfort. And as European powers established colonies, beer went right with them. In North America, the early settlers brought barley, hops, and brewing knowledge. The first breweries in the colonies were small, often home based operations, but by the mid 1600s, public breweries began to appear, especially in places with access to clean water and good grain. Boston, New Amsterdam, later New York, and Philadelphia all became early brewing centers. In the Caribbean, beer was also brewed, but the hot climate favored rum, a rival that would go on to dominate local spirits. Still, imported beer remained a sought after luxury among Europeans abroad. Shipping beer across long distances posed some challenges. Without refrigeration, beer could spoil or lose its character during long voyages. This led to the development of export styles. Beers brewed stronger, hoppier, or with different techniques so they could survive the trip. For example, porter from London began to be exported in large quantities. India Pale Ale, IPA, would emerge in the 18th century, brewed with extra hops to endure the journey from England to India. Export stouts made their way to the Baltic states, richer and stronger than the versions sold at home. These beers weren't just survival drinks, they became prestige imports in their destinations, building global reputations. And beer became part of the larger web of global trade, too. Dutch, English, and later German merchants exported beer alongside textiles, tools, and other goods. Breweries near major ports flourished, sending casks to colonies and trade outposts. In return, these breweries received new ingredients and influences, spices from the East, sugars from the Caribbean, and in some cases, entirely new brewing techniques. Imagine a tavern in Boston in 1700, a low-ceilinged room filled with the warm smell of wood smoke and fresh bread. Rough-hewn tables crowded with sailors, merchants, and townsfolk. On the bar, pewter tankards and clay mugs are filled from wooden casks stacked behind the counter. The beer is darker and maltier than most modern brews, with a gentle sweetness and a faint tang from long storage. Outside, the harbor smells of salt and tar. Inside, the tavern is a pocket of warmth, lit by candlelight, filled with the low rumble of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. Introducing colonial grog, the drink that built a nation one questionable pint at a time. Half ale, half rum, half water. Wait, that's three halves. But then again, colonial math gave us taxation without representation, so we'll call it tradition. Colonial grog, hearty enough to survive a transatlantic voyage, mild enough to fuel 6-hour debates about import duties, perfect for town meetings, midnight rides, or contemplating revolution while gazing moodily across Boston Harbor. Warning, may contain traces of barrel splinters, sea salt, and the faint taste of rebellion, colonial grog, because sometimes liberty tastes a little rustic. By the end of the colonial era, beer was truly global, brewed in monasteries and royal breweries in Europe, brewed in small public houses and taverns in the colonies, exported in barrels across oceans, adapted to climates, resources, and local tastes. The beer that left Europe wasn't always the same beer that arrived in the New World, but that adaptability became one of beer's greatest strengths. Beer was now not just a drink of one region or culture, it was a traveling companion of empire, migration, and trade, a liquid map of the world's connections. And as the 18th century approached, industrialization was on the horizon. Brewing was about to become bigger, faster, and more precise than ever before. By the mid 19th century, beer was no longer just a tavern drink. It was an industry. And in the industrial age, industry meant scale. Before the Industrial Revolution, beer was brewed in small batches. Taverns, local breweries, monasteries. Production was intimate, tied to the local grain, local water, and local taste. But the Industrial Age changed everything. Larger copper kettles meant more beer could be brewed at once. Steam power replaced manual stirring and hauling. Railroads meant beer could be shipped hundreds of miles inland from port cities. Breweries that had once supplied just a neighborhood were now supplying entire regions. One of the biggest leaps? Refrigeration. Before refrigeration, brewing was seasonal. Certain beers, especially lagers, needed cool temperatures to ferment properly. That meant lager brewing was limited to cooler months, or to caves and cellars that could stay cold. But with mechanical refrigeration, breweries could produce lager year-round and at scale. Picture a brewery in Munich in 1870. Great copper kettles steaming under high rafters, the smell of sweet smalt and spicy hops hanging thick in the air. In the cool storage rooms, rows of wooden lagering casks sit quietly, each one chilled by the hum of early refrigeration systems. The beer is clean, crisp, consistent, and it can be brewed in quantities unimaginable a century earlier. Another revolution? Glass bottles. Before the 19th century, beer was served mostly from wooden casks or clay mugs. Bottled beer existed, but glass was very expensive and inconsistent. Industrial glassmaking changed all that. Suddenly, beer could be bottled uniformly, sealed with caps, and shipped far and wide. This did two things. It made beer portable, perfect for the new working classes in cities or soldiers on the move, and it created brand loyalty. Now you could recognize your beer by the label, the logo, or the look of the bottle. The era of iconic brands, Bass, Guinness, Pilsner Urquell, began right here. In 1842, in the city of Pilsen, in what is now the Czech Republic, something new was born. Pilsner. Clear, golden, sparkling, and brilliantly crisp. Pilsner was unlike the darker, cloudier beers common in the era. Its brilliance came from pale malt, soft local water, bottom fermenting yeast, lagering in cold cellars for weeks. Pilsner quickly became the most imitated beer style in the world. By the late 19th century, Pale lager had become the global standard, the beer most people picture when they think beer. Mass brewing, refrigeration, and efficient shipping meant that beer was now both affordable and accessible to more people than ever. Imagine walking into a beer hall in Vienna in 1890. Long marble tables, brass taps gleaming in the light, waiters carrying trays stacked with mugs of golden lager topped with snowy foam. The air is alive with conversation, the clink of glass, and the yeasty aroma of beer poured fresh from great oak casks. Beer is no longer just for travelers, nobles, or monks. It's the drink of the everyman, the factory worker, the shopkeeper, the university student. And by the turn of the 20th century, breweries in Germany, Britain, the Czech lands, and Belgium were shipping beer worldwide. Immigrants brought their beer styles with them to the Americas and to Africa and Asia. Brewing was becoming standardized, globalized, industrialized, and consumption was skyrocketing. But with industrial success came something else: homogenization. By the mid 20th century, pale lager dominated almost every market. It was clean, consistent, and sometimes critics would say too consistent. The old diversity of beer styles, the porters, saisons, sour ales, herbal groots, had been overshadowed by the sparkling golden lager. It was only a matter of time before some adventurous brewers would start to bring back the variety. By the early 20th century, beer wasn't just part of daily life, it was everywhere. From cozy corner taverns in Milwaukee to sprawling beer halls in Munich, beer was thriving. And then, in the United States, the taps went dry. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of all alcoholic beverages became illegal in the United States. For beer, it was as if someone had pulled the emergency brake on a train at full speed. Breweries, from tiny local operations to towering industrial facilities, were forced to stop production overnight. Some tried to adapt. A few made near beer, low alcohol versions that technically complied with the law. Others turned to sodas, malt syrup, or ice cream just to keep the lights on. Picture a grand Milwaukee brewery in 1921. The great copper kettles still stand beneath the vaulted ceiling. The air still smells faintly of malt and yeast, but instead of beer flowing into barrels, the workers are bottling ginger ale. The head brewer walks the floor, quietly praying that the repeal will come before the yeast cultures and the brewery's legacy fade away. Of course, beer never truly vanished. In hidden speakeasies and back rooms, bootleggers found ways to keep the taps flowing. The beer might have been flat, sometimes even sour, but it kept the tradition alive in the shadows. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition, and America could finally raise a legal glass again. The return of beer was met with celebration. Taverns reopened, barrels rolled back into cities, and breweries fired up their kettles once more. But the industry had changed. Many small breweries hadn't survived the 13 dry years. Those that did were often larger, better funded, and better positioned to take over the market. And American tastes had also shifted. Years of drinking lighter, lower alcohol substitutes during Prohibition had made pale, easy drinking lagers the new standard. Beer in post repeal America was crisp, consistent, and familiar, a safe choice for a nation rebuilding after the Depression. Just as breweries were regaining their footing, World War II erupted. Once again, beer was enlisted for the cause. Breweries produced beer for soldiers overseas, shipping cans and bottles to military bases around the world. Beer was more than refreshment, it was a connection to home. Advertising of the era linked beer directly to patriotism. Posters showed soldiers enjoying a cold beer on leave, smiling in their uniforms. Buy war bonds campaigns were flanked by foamy glasses. The message clear: beer was part of the American spirit. But wartime rationing hit hard. Grain was prioritized for food, and breweries had to make do with what they could get. This pushed American beer even further toward lighter, more economical styles. And when the war ended, beer came home, and so did millions of soldiers who had grown accustomed to it. The brewing industry boomed. Breweries expanded, and distribution networks spread further than ever thanks to refrigerated trucks and rail cars. But smaller regional breweries struggled to compete with the sheer reach of the national brands. One by one, they were bought out, merged, or closed. And by the 1950s and 60s, American beer was dominated by just a handful of names: Anheuser-Busch, Miller, Coors, Pabst. Their beer was consistent, affordable, and easy to find. It was also increasingly similar from one brand to the next. By the 1970s, pale lager reigned supreme. Beer advertising focused more on loyalty. Your beer brand was your identity. The variety that had once defined beer, the porters, stouts, sours, saisons, had largely vanished from the mainstream. But underground, something was stirring. Home brewers were experimenting in garages. Travelers were returning from Europe with stories of richer, more diverse beers. And a few adventurous entrepreneurs were quietly imagining a return to flavor, variety, and risk taking. The stage was set for a beer revolution, and that revolution would arrive in the form of the craft beer revival, a perfect place to talk about big flavors, bold experiments, and perhaps a small, unforgettable brew pub run by two brothers who brewed more chaos than beer. By the late 1970s, beer in America had settled into a predictable pattern. The shelves were dominated by a handful of national brands. The beers were pale, crisp, and reliable, but they didn't surprise you. If you wanted a porter, a stout, a saison, you might have to leave the country to actually find one. But quietly, in garages, basements, and backyards, there really was a new wave brewing. In 1978, home brewing became legal in the United States for the first time since Prohibition. And almost overnight, the hobby exploded. Home brewers started experimenting with recipes, sometimes to recreate the beers they'd tasted abroad. sometimes just to see what might happen if they added, say, 3 different kinds of hops, or cocoa nibs, or whatever happened to be in the pantry. Picture a garage in Colorado in 1981. A big stainless steel kettle sits on a propane burner. The air is thick with the smell of sweet wort and boiling hops. 2 friends in flannel shirts are stirring carefully, glancing at hydrometers and making notes on yellow legal pads. A 6-pack of someone else's beer sits nearby, part reference, part reward. They're not just making beer, they're laying the groundwork for a revolution. By the early 1980s, the first wave of microbreweries appeared in the U.S. They weren't glamorous. Many operated in industrial parks, converted warehouses, or even old dairy facilities. But they had one thing in common. They brewed beers you couldn't get anywhere else. Sierra Nevada, founded in 1980 in Chico, California, became a pioneer. Its pale ale, packed with Cascade hops, tasted like nothing on the shelves at the time. Anchor Brewing in San Francisco revived traditional styles like steam beer. New Albion Brewery, though short-lived, became a model for what a small-scale craft brewery could be. These beers weren't designed to please everyone. They were bold, flavorful, and distinctive. And for drinkers tired of the same 3 lagers, they really were a revolution. And by the 1990s, the craft beer movement had picked up speed. Microbreweries, soon called craft breweries, popped up in cities and towns across the country. Each had its own personality. Some specialized in Belgian-style ales, others in hop-forward IPAs, others in dark, rich stouts. Beer festivals became showcases for creativity. Brewers competed, not just for sales, but for bragging rights. The question wasn't, what's your biggest seller? It was, what did you brew that nobody else has tried? Imagine walking into a craft beer festival in 1995. Rows of small booths, each with its own hand-painted sign. The air is alive with the smell of malt, hops, and grilled food from nearby stands. Glasses clink. People lean in close to hear each other over the buzz. You take a sip of beer infused with coffee or chocolate and realize that beer will never be the same again. Now, as the craft movement grew, so did brewpubs, breweries with their own bars or restaurants. They became a cornerstone of the scene. Here, beer wasn't just sold, it was experienced. Customers could sit a few feet from the tanks where the beer was actually brewed. They could smell the mash in the air and watch brewers at work. Brewpubs became hubs for experimentation. Seasonal beers, limited releases, wild ingredient pairings. If a brewer wanted to try something new, they could pour it directly to the people. And it wasn't always smooth. Brewpubs were living, breathing experiments. Sometimes the beer was brilliant. Sometimes it was memorable for other reasons. And of course, not every brewpub ran like a Swiss watch. There was one small operation, run by 2 brothers, that became the stuff of local legend. Their beer inspired, their teamwork, well, let's just say it had a head on it. Some days the taps poured IPAs so fresh the regulars swore they'd reach brewing enlightenment. Other days the beer wasn't the only thing with a little funk. The place just lasted a single glorious season, but for those who were there, the stories are still on tap, passed quietly from one beer lover to another, like a secret handshake. Now, by the 2000s, craft beer was no longer a fringe curiosity. It had gone mainstream. Supermarkets carried local IPAs. Restaurants offered beer pairings with food. Television shows and movies began to feature craft breweries as settings. Some craft breweries grew into national brands like Sam Adams, Sierra Nevada, New Belgium, while others stayed proudly local, serving only their own neighborhoods. The diversity of beer styles exploded. Sours, barrel aged stouts, hazy New England IPAs, farmhouse ales. Craft brewers turned beer into a playground of flavors. Beer wasn't just something you drank, it became something you talked about, traveled for, even planned vacations around. Beer tourism grew. People traveled to cities like Portland or Denver, San Diego, and Asheville just to visit breweries. Festivals like the Great American Beer Festival became pilgrimages. And in pop culture, beer became a signifier of personality. A character's beer choice said something about them. A macro lager might suggest tradition or simplicity. A craft IPA might suggest adventurousness, and an unusual sour ale, well, that might say they're full of surprises. Craft beer changed the way people thought about beer. It reintroduced variety, creativity, and a sense of place. It reminded drinkers that beer could be as nuanced and complex as wine, and sometimes just a lot more fun. It also created a new standard. Even the big beer companies began producing craft style lines. Beer drinkers expected more than just something cold and fizzy. And at the heart of it all, craft beer proved something important, that in an age of mass production, people still crave the personal, the local, the unique. And somewhere in that landscape, a little brew pub run by two brothers will always be part of that legend, at least for those who know where to look. Now, if the 80s and 90s were craft beer's childhood, the 2000s were its coming of age. In 2000, there were fewer than 1,500 craft breweries in America. But by 2015, that number had exploded to over 4,000. And by 2019, nearly 8,400. Picture driving through any American city in 2012. What used to be empty storefronts and old warehouses were now just buzzing with the warm glow of brewery tap rooms. The smell of malt and hops drifted from industrial districts that had been quiet for decades. This wasn't just business growth, it was a cultural renaissance. And nothing defined the craft beer explosion quite like the IPA. In the early 2000s, IPAs were hoppy but restrained. But by 2010, brewers were pushing boundaries. Double IPAs, triple IPAs, imperial IPAs with alcohol contents that would make a wine blush. The hop varieties multiplied. Citra, Mosaic, Galaxy, Amarillo. Each one brought its own personality. Tropical fruit, pine forest, floral gardens, citrus groves. Brewers collected hops like painters collected pigments. And beer festivals became hop showcases. Drinkers lined up not just for a taste, but to experience flavors they'd never imagined beer could hold. A sip of a citra-forward IPA might transport you to a sun-warmed grapefruit grove. A mosaic IPA could taste like a handful of fresh berries. But the real magic happened at the local level. Every neighborhood, it seemed, wanted its own brewery, not just a place to buy beer. A third space, somewhere between home and work, where community could happen. Imagine walking into a neighborhood taproom in Portland in 2014. Exposed brick walls lined with chalkboard menus, mismatched furniture, some vintage, some clearly handmade. The bartender knows your name and your usual order. Kids play board games while parents sip from flights of beer. An acoustic guitarist sets up in the corner for the evening's entertainment. This wasn't just about the beer anymore. It was about belonging. And by the 2010s, people were planning those vacations and trips around beer. Again, cities like San Diego, Denver, Portland became beer destinations, brewery tours, beer weeks, tap takeovers. Beer had become an experience industry. The Great American Beer Festival in Denver grew from a modest gathering to a pilgrimage site. Hotel rooms booked up months in advance. Airlines even offered brewery tour packages. Even small towns got in on the action. A sleepy Vermont village might suddenly find itself on beer tourism maps because of one innovative brewery making sour ales in converted dairy barns. Now, with so much variety came a new species, the beer geek. Apps like Untapped turned beer drinking into a social network. People checked in their beers, rated them, shared photos. Rare beer releases became events. People would camp out overnight for a bottle of limited edition barrel aged stout. Beer bars evolved to keep up. Some offered hundreds of bottles and dozens of taps. Others specialized in the rarest, most sought after releases. A single bottle might cost $50, even $100. The language changed too. People didn't just drink beer. They cellared vintage bottles, discussed mouthfeel and character, debated the merits of different yeast strains. And social media changed how people experienced beer too. Suddenly, every pint needed to be photogenic. Breweries started thinking about how their beers would look on Instagram. Hazy IPAs became partly popular because they photographed beautifully. All that cloudy, golden opacity looked like liquid sunshine. Beer labels became art projects. Craft breweries hired graphic designers, illustrators, and even fine artists. A beer's appearance on the shelf became almost as important as its taste in the glass. But by the mid 2010s, cracks were starting to show. With thousands of new breweries opening each year, competition became fierce, and not every neighborhood could support 3 craft breweries. Not every IPA could find its audience. The industry was growing faster than the market could absorb. Shelf space became precious. Tap handles became battlegrounds. And then came the signs that the party might not last forever. Beer doesn't just live in glasses. Once the craft revival took hold, beer spilled out of tap rooms and into the culture itself. Beer advertising had been a fixture of American culture for decades, from the jingle heavy spots of the 1950s to the iconic slogans of the 70s and 80s. It's Miller time. This bud's for you. Tastes great, less filling. The big brands owned television time, sponsoring sports, late night shows, even primetime sitcoms. But as craft beer took hold, the tone changed. The new ads weren't about mass market loyalty. They were about flavor, place, and story. A beer wasn't just cold and refreshing. It was brewed in a small mountain town by people with names you might actually know. Movies and TV have always known the power of a pint. Beer appears as shorthand for camaraderie. Think Cheers, Rebellion, Animal House, Sophistication, Mad Men's post-work pours, and relaxation, countless backyard barbecue scenes. As craft beer rose, more shows and films began to set scenes in brew pubs and tap rooms. The brewery wasn't just a place to drink, it was a backdrop for story, personality, and a certain lived in authenticity. And somewhere in this era, there was a short lived series about two brothers running a chaotic little brew pub. The show burned bright, just one glorious season, but it captured something real about craft beer: the ambition, the unpredictability, the stubborn refusal to do anything the easy way. Some who watched still talk about it the way beer lovers talk about a rare seasonal release. Here for a moment, then gone, but remembered fondly by those lucky enough to have tasted it. The beer works so well on screen because it's recognizable, unpretentious, and adaptable. It can be the pint in the hand of a weary detective at the end of the day. It can be the symbol of a hometown, dazed and confused kegs on a Friday night. It can be the sign of a celebration or a reconciliation or just a moment shared between friends. And whether it's a mass market lager or a small batch hazy IPA, it says something about the person holding it. By the 2010s, beer had a solid place in American pop culture again, not just as a drink, but as a character in its own right. Commercials still aired during the Super Bowl, brewery scenes still popped up in films, and every time a camera lingered on a perfectly poured pint, beer's cultural story just keeps rewriting itself. In the end, beer in pop culture is just like beer in life. Sometimes it's the star of the show, and sometimes it's just there, quietly making the whole scene better. The craft beer boom had been so explosive that it seemed like it might go on forever. But around 2015, something was changing in American drinking culture. The generation that had embraced craft beer was evolving. Millennials, the demographic that had driven much of that craft beer explosion, were entering their 30s. Some were having kids, others were becoming more health conscious, many were drinking less alcohol overall. At the same time, a new generation was coming of age with very different priorities entirely. In 2016, White Claw launched with little fanfare, but by 2019, hard seltzer was one of the fastest growing alcohol categories in America. The appeal was obvious: lower calories, gluten free, crisp and refreshing, and simple. While craft beer had become increasingly complex: double dry hopped hazy IPAs with lactose and vanilla, seltzers offered the opposite: Clean, easy, uncomplicated. Picture a summer pool party in 2019, where there might once have been a cooler full of craft IPAs. Now there are rows of sleek seltzer cans. The conversation isn't about hop varieties or ABV percentages. It's about which flavor, mango, black cherry, lime, goes best with the afternoon sun. Hard seltzer, it wasn't trying to be craft beer. It wasn't competing on complexity or tradition. It was competing on convenience, health consciousness, and pure refreshment. At the same time, American whiskey was having its own moment. Craft distilleries were popping up almost as fast as craft breweries had a decade earlier. Bourbon, rye, and American whiskey were becoming collectible, discussable, Instagram worthy. For some drinkers, spirits offered what craft beer had originally promised: authenticity, craftsmanship, and local character, but in a more concentrated form. Wine, too, was evolving. Natural wines, orange wines, and low intervention winemaking were attracting that same adventurous palate that had once explored sour beers and barrel aged stouts. And then there was cannabis. As marijuana legalization spread across states, some drinkers began substituting cannabis for alcohol entirely. Why deal with hangovers when you could achieve relaxation without the next day consequences? Cannabis lounges started appearing in legal states, social spaces that served the same community function that brewpubs had pioneered, but without alcohol. Health trends were reshaping drinking culture entirely. Athletic recovery drinks, functional beverages, kombucha, CBD infused drinks. The beverage landscape was exploding with alternatives that promised benefits beyond intoxication. Non alcoholic beers, once a punchline, were suddenly serious business. Companies like Athletic Brewing built entire brands around alcohol free craft beer that actually tasted good. Some breweries began offering session versions of their popular beers, lower alcohol, lighter calories, but still flavorful enough to satisfy craft beer lovers. Meanwhile, the craft beer industry was discovering that growth couldn't continue indefinitely. By 2018, brewery closures were becoming more common. Some breweries that had seemed successful just years earlier were struggling to find their market. Distribution became harder, competition for tap handles intensified. The novelty of local brewery was wearing off in markets that had 4 or 5 local breweries but really only needed 1 or 2. Customers became quite selective, more demanding. The industry didn't just surrender to these challenges. Breweries began diversifying. Many started producing hard seltzers of their own. Others expanded into spirits distillation. Some added coffee roasting or food operations. Innovation continued, but in different directions. Low calorie IPAs, fruit forward sours that appealed to wine drinkers, coffee stouts that competed with artisanal coffee culture. Some breweries leaned into experience over product, offering elaborate food pairings, hosting concerts, creating destination experiences that couldn't be replicated at home. And then came 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic closed tap rooms, canceled festivals, and forced the entire industry to rethink its social, community centered model. But it also accelerated some trends that were already underway. Canned beer became more important than ever. Direct to consumer sales exploded. Delivery and takeout became standard. Some breweries thrived by pivoting quickly. Others, especially those dependent on tourism or large events, struggled to survive. The pandemic forced everyone, brewers and drinkers alike, to think about what beer really meant to them. Today, craft beer exists in a more competitive, more diverse beverage landscape than ever before. It's no longer the only craft option. Consumers can choose craft spirits, artisanal seltzers, small batch wine, or premium non alcoholic options. But beer still has advantages that are hard to replicate: its social history, its food friendliness, its incredible versatility, and its ability to be both simple and complex. The most successful breweries today aren't trying to be everything to everyone. They're finding their niche, serving their community, and making beer that reminds people why they fell in love with craft brewing in the first place. The boom might be over, but the culture, the appreciation for quality, creativity, and community remains. Beer isn't going anywhere. It's just learning to share the bar. The beer industry of 2024 looks different than anyone could have predicted even a decade ago. After years of explosive growth, the craft beer industry has entered what economists might call a mature market phase. Some breweries have been acquired by larger companies, not always the macro beer giants, but mid sized players looking to expand their portfolios. Others have closed quietly, their dreams of local beer fame dissolving like foam on a warm day. But the survivors, they've learned to be smarter, more focused, more sustainable. Today's successful craft breweries often look different than their predecessors. Many are smaller, more local, more community focused. Instead of trying to distribute across multiple states, they perfect their neighborhood presence. The tap room becomes the center of the business model. Others have embraced the contract brewing model, creating recipes and brands without owning their own production facilities. It's less romantic, but often more financially viable. And some have become hybrid businesses: part brewery, part restaurant, part event space. They're not just selling beer, they're selling an experience. Modern brewing looks different too. Quality control has become incredibly sophisticated. Breweries use spectrometers, automated temperature controls, and data logging systems that would have amazed medieval monks. Many breweries now offer apps for ordering, loyalty programs, and even virtual brewery tours. The connection between brewer and consumer has become more direct, even when they're physically apart. Crowdsourced funding has enabled brewery startups that might never have attracted traditional investment. Communities can literally invest in their own local brewery. Beer flavors continue to evolve, but often in response to broader cultural trends like low alcohol and non alcoholic beers that have become serious business. Companies spend significant resources making 0.0% ABV beers that actually taste good. Functional ingredients are appearing more often: probiotics, adaptogens, vitamins. Beer is sometimes marketed as much for wellness as for flavor. Environmental consciousness is driving ingredient choices: local sourcing, organic grains, sustainable packaging. Breweries are responding to consumer values beyond just taste. While American craft beer faces domestic challenges, the movement has gone global in unexpected ways. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and Brazil have developed thriving craft beer scenes inspired by but distinct from the American model. Their beers reflect local ingredients, traditions, and tastes. European breweries, some of them centuries old, have embraced American style innovation while maintaining their traditional roots. The conversation about beer is now truly global. A brewery in Portland might collaborate with one in Copenhagen, sharing techniques and ingredients across continents. Beer now competes in a landscape unimaginable even 20 years ago. Hard seltzers have claimed significant market share, especially among younger, health conscious drinkers. Ready to drink cocktails offer convenience and variety. Cannabis products provide relaxation without hangovers. But beer has responded by emphasizing its unique strengths: its food compatibility, its social traditions, its incredible versatility, and its relatively moderate alcohol content. Perhaps most importantly, craft beer has permanently changed American drinking culture. Even if someone chooses a seltzer or a cocktail, they now expect quality, local sourcing, and authenticity, values that the craft beer movement established. The idea that your drink should reflect your personality and values, that local is often better than national, that quality justifies higher prices. These concepts now extend far beyond beer. Beer's next chapter is being written now. Climate change is affecting hop and barley growing regions, forcing brewers to adapt. Water scarcity in some areas is pushing innovation in water conservation and recycling. Even packaging is evolving. Aluminum cans are increasingly popular for environmental reasons. Some breweries are experimenting with reusable containers. The social role of beer continues to evolve. As remote work changes how people socialize, neighborhood breweries are adapting to serve as community centers in new ways. Through all these changes, beer remains remarkably resilient. It survived Prohibition, it survived two world wars, it survived the era of mass produced uniformity, and then the chaos of the craft beer saturation. Now it's learning to thrive in a world where consumers have more choices than ever before. The beer of 2024 might be lower in alcohol or more environmentally conscious and sold through different channels than even the beer of 2014, but it still serves the same fundamental human needs: community, relaxation, celebration, and the simple pleasure of a well made drink. Beer has always been adaptable. That's how it survived 7,000 years. And that's how it'll survive whatever comes next. And so we set down our glass. Beer's story has taken us from ancient clay jars in Mesopotamia to bustling medieval taverns, to clinking steins in beer halls, to icy bottles on front porches. We've drifted through the craft revival creativity and even the occasional chaotic brewpub run by two brothers who could use a better tap schedule. It's been a long pour. Outside the window, the world has changed 1,000 times over since beer first bubbled into being. But the glass in your hand, it's still part of that same lineage, a connection across centuries. The night is quiet now. Somewhere in the distance, you can almost hear that soft hum of a bar winding down. Chairs turned upside down on tables, the faint hiss of the last tap being cleaned. The scent of malt and hops lingers, like a memory you can't quite place. Beer has never been about rushing. It's about moments, shared or solitary. The first sip on a summer evening, the toast that seals a friendship, the quiet pint at the end of a long day. And tonight, maybe it's about the story, the way the tale of beer has flowed across time, carrying us here to this gentle last sip. So take a deep breath, let the glass rest on the table. The foam has settled, the night air is cool, and somewhere in the background, the world is still turning, just like it always has. Beer will be here tomorrow, and so will we. Good night.